So earlier this summer, I went over to Malawi, Africa. I went over there to visit a guy named Gret Glyer, who runs a non-profit organization called HOMES, which is spelled HOWMS, and stands for Homes for Widows and Orphans of Malawi. So I went to Africa because I wanted to get the real experience of what it's really like living in a third world country. So while I was there, I got to see the local market, got to visit the youth prison, got to see several of the villages where the poorest of the poor live, got to visit Lake Malawi, which is really neat, and I got to see the latest project that Gret had been working on at the time, which is Girls Shine Academy. And I got to meet a missions group that was over there called Live Love with a church from Arizona. So Gret has a YouTube channel that he calls Bad Missionary, and if you want to know why he calls it Bad Missionary, go check out his Bad Missionary podcast, episode 1. So when I first started watching Gret's channel, he used to do a weekly video called Village Fridays, where every Friday he would post a video of a person in need in a remote village in Malawi.
Welcome to Village Fridays, a series where you get to be a part of helping people in a remote Malawian village.
So Gret would go into the villages and he would talk to the leaders of the village and the chiefs of the village to find out who was in the most need. Then he'd do a short video on that person's need, and the needs could range anywhere from building someone a new house to getting them malaria medication or even building them a pigsty. So then people in America and other countries would see the need and would be able to donate to it. The thing that I thought was really cool about this is the fact that 100% of what gets donated actually goes to the project that you're donating for. And then the next week, Gret would post a video of the completed project. So you really got to see what your money was actually doing. So when I went over there, which was in June of 2016, the latest project that Gret had been working on was building a girls' school called Girls Shine Academy in a remote village in Malawi. So when I was there, the school was still under construction, but it has since been completed, and they've actually started holding classes already. This year they've got about 100 students, but they're hoping that'll be doubled or more next year. So Gret's latest project is an app called Donor C, which was just recently released, and it's designed so that missionaries throughout the world can post pictures or videos of people in need, and anybody else who follows them on the app can then go through and make small donations to various projects or other immediate needs, and then we'll then receive a follow-up video once that need has been met. And this just allows us to be much more connected and more efficiently fund these projects and immediate needs. So before I left, I had to get my passport, which was a small adventure in itself, and then I had to get my vaccinations. I had to get a hepatitis A shot, I had to take 4 typhoid fever pills, and then I had to take malaria pills. So I flew out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We had a little bit of trouble finding the parking ramp. Alright, so we are at the airport
And lost.
but we have no idea where we're supposed to be going.
We see the tower.
Yeah, the tower's up there.
Daily parking ahead.
So from Milwaukee, I flew up to St. Paul, all the way out to Los Angeles, California, had a small holdover, and then flew all the way back across the United States, up through Canada, and all the way over to Dublin, Ireland, where we stopped. And I thought this was my stop, so I was going to get off the plane. Thankfully, there was a guy on the ramp who stopped me and told me that this was not my stop, and I needed to return to the plane, where I sat for about an hour before we took off again. So it was about a 9-hour flight from Los Angeles all the way to Ireland. And then I sat for an hour, and then it was about another 9 or 9.5 hours down to Addis Ababa, Africa. I had a short holdover there for about 2 or 3 hours.
Alright, well after being on the plane for about 19 hours, I'm finally on the ground in Addis Ababa, Africa. I'm waiting for my next plane. It's about 6 o'clock in the morning, and the next plane doesn't leave till 9:15, so I'll be sitting here.
So then from Addis Ababa, I flew down to Lilongwe, which is the capital city of Malawi. So I left Wisconsin on a Monday, and I arrived in Malawi on a Wednesday, and Malawi is about 7 hours ahead of us here in Wisconsin. So once I arrived in Lilongwe, I had to fill out paperwork for a travel visa, which didn't take too long, it was pretty quick. And then I met up with 2 guys who were going to be my guides for the week, Prince Ingalls and Juma Mkanda. And Prince actually allowed me to stay at his house with him while I was there, which is super neat because here I am, this complete stranger from America, coming over and meeting this guy that I'd never met before, and he's letting me stay in his house. It was really nice because then I didn't have to rent the place while I was there, which really cut down on costs. And it also gave me a much better feel for what it was actually like living there, because Prince lived in a poorer area, not the poorest of the poor, but I would say middle class area of the city. So after I arrived, Prince and Juma took me to Gret's house, where I had my first introduction to African food. We had this stuff called nsima, which is made from ground maize or corn, and is then mixed with water and boiled down into a thick porridge. It really doesn't have a whole lot of flavor to it, but they eat it with just about every meal over there. It's kind of like a filler, like we use bread over here. So then after eating, Prince and Juma took me into town to a bank so that I could exchange my American dollars for the Malawian currency, which is called kwacha, and the conversion rate is about 710 kwacha to $1. So one of the things I was really surprised to learn once I got over there is that English is actually the official language of Malawi, and most of the people in the cities over there actually speak English, and they also speak their native language, which is called Chichewa. Most of the poorer people in the villages, however, only speak Chichewa. So after we exchanged money, we went grocery shopping, which was a strange experience for me because things were priced in the thousands of kwacha, which was difficult for me to determine whether or not it was priced well without actually sitting down and doing the conversions back to American dollars. But everything over there is actually, for the most part, quite a bit cheaper than it is here in America. I was also surprised to learn that they actually have in the cities quite nice stores. The grocery store that we stopped at was just as nice as any small grocery store here in the United States. They also had department stores just like any that we would have here. So there are many nice things in the capital city, or in the bigger cities, but the thing is that it's still a third world country, and there are huge differences between the people who live in the cities and the people who live in the villages and who have almost nothing. So after grocery shopping, we went back to Prince's house, and his entire neighborhood was without electricity. So I wasn't feeling so great from all my flying and traveling, so I went and took about a 40-minute nap, and by the time I woke up, the electricity had come on, and Prince had actually cooked up the hamburgers that we had bought at the grocery store. So we had a quick meal, and then we just sat and talked and listened to music for the rest of the night. It was really neat getting to sit there in the middle of Africa and talk with someone, realizing it's the same God that connects both of us, and it was just super neat because I just felt right at home. So Prince had been living in his house for about a week, and while we were sitting there talking, two neighborhood boys, about 6 years old, came right in the front door, introduced themselves, and sat down and talked with us for a little bit, and it really showed me the trust that they have over there for one another, because even though he'd only been there for a week, the mothers weren't concerned that their children were just wandering into the houses of other people, and there's no way you would ever see that here in the U.S., and that's something that I continued to see throughout my trip, was just the trust that they have for one another. On the other hand, there is also some mistrust, because being a third world country, there is some theft and burglarization that goes on, so a lot of houses you'll see will actually have a barbed wire fence around them, which is something that you'll never see in America. So the next morning, which was Thursday, Prince and Juma took me to the local market, and to get there was a small river we had to cross, and this rickety old bridge that felt like it was going to collapse at any moment.
So it's a private bridge.
Oh, okay.
50 quad.
I see.
The town was named after this river,
Okay.
the Lilongwe River. So here it's like they sell second-hand clothes.
Okay. So the market is a huge area where people have booths set up, and sometimes they're packed so tightly together that you can hardly get between them. And they sell anything from toys to electronics to shoes, clothing, and of course vegetables and all kinds of food. And it was really neat because there's so much variety there. You can find anything you're looking for, and from what I'm told, the prices are quite good. I didn't actually buy anything because I didn't have enough room to take anything home with me on the plane anyway. Since for the most part people don't have refrigerators over there just because they're so expensive, the meat that they sold at the market was actually butchered that morning, and then they would try to sell all of it by the evening. And we actually stopped at one booth that was selling beef, slices of beef. You just buy these slice of beef, and then they would cut it up and grill it for you, and then you just sit there and pretty much eat it off of toothpicks. So then to get back to our vehicle, we, instead of walking back, we took public transportation, which was about an 8-passenger van that they crammed about 15 people in, and then trucked us all back to our vehicle. So what Gret explained to me is that in Malawi there are various social classes or groups where the white people are kind of considered to be on top. They're generally the richer people, and then there'll be your middle class people who are people that live in the cities and have jobs and a little bit of disposable income, and then you've got the lowest of the low, the people who live in the villages in pretty much third world country setting, where they have, you know, barely a hut to keep their family in, and they just farm and live off the land and really have no disposable income. The very poorest of the poor are the widows. One thing I noticed right away is that there's garbage everywhere on the ground in the city. And Prince explained to me that people in Malawi have just always thrown their garbage on the ground, and getting them to change that habit is very difficult. So when the garbage gets to be too thick in places, they just put it in piles and burn it right on the spot. So I noticed that there is always a smell of smoke coming from somewhere. Either it's burning garbage or people burning grass in the fields. So after the market, we went to a wildlife sanctuary that had a restaurant, and we stopped to have lunch and see some of the animals there. And then we went to the youth prison, which has about 250 inmates crammed into about 8 cells. Now I'm not sure how big the cells are, but I know they're not big enough to house all 250 inmates. And so I shared my testimony there. Prince actually does a prison ministry, and it was also pretty neat getting to talk to the officers there about how the prison is run. So it didn't take long for me to share my testimony, and then we headed out. So then Friday morning we went to see the woodcarvers market, which is pretty neat. They've got hundreds and hundreds of hand-carved items. And then that evening I actually got to go with Gret to a park and play Ultimate Frisbee. We had about 8 or 10 people there that Gret knew from various parts of the world and Malawi. I was actually quite surprised at how good everybody was at Ultimate Frisbee. It was really neat to be on completely another side of the world, but to be playing a game that is so familiar to me. So the next morning, which was Saturday, we got up pretty early and headed out to go see Lake Malawi, which is about a 3-hour drive from where we were staying. And Lake Malawi is a huge lake. It's so long you can't see across it, and the water is super clear. It's almost like a tropical paradise. And on the way to the lake, I got to see a lot of neat scenery, which reminded me a lot of the Southwest United States. So while we were headed there, we actually had one of our many police encounters. I actually got stopped because Juma, who was driving, was actually speeding. So we just got stopped by the police because the driver of our vehicle was speeding, and they're taking forever to talk to him. They've got him over across the road. It seems like this happens every day that we get stopped, because they just do completely random stops here. Check people for their license, registration, proof of insurance. And they didn't seem to want me to be taking any pictures, so that's why I'm keeping the camera though. So the police had this set up where they had a radar gun on a tripod on the side of the road, and they were checking vehicles. Of course, they stopped us. So I tried to take a picture of the radar gun, and they got pretty upset about that. They didn't want me taking a picture. So Prince later explained to me that there's a lot of corruption in the police force over there, and so they don't like people taking pictures or video of them because that could expose some of the corruption. So after Prince and Juma talked to the police for a while, we finally got to leave. And the way police do things over there is completely different than they do in the United States. Over there, they'll set up just a random spot along the road where they will just kind of set up a small barricade, and they'll just randomly stop vehicles that are going through and check them for their license, their proof of insurance, and registration, and then let people go on their way. They don't use a lot of squad cars like over here. It's mostly all done by people standing in the street, which makes me very thankful that we don't have random stops here in the United States, because we got stopped many times, and for the most part we didn't have any problems, except that about halfway through my trip, Juma actually lost his driver's license, and so he ended up getting a ticket out of that, but finally he found it again. So once we got to the lake, we stayed in these small huts near the beach, and for the 3 of us, we got 2 huts. Prince and Juma stayed in one, and I stayed in one myself, and for the 3 huts for the night, it only cost 15,000 kwacha, which is about $21. So I wasn't super excited about swimming in the lake just because I can swim anytime here in the US, but Prince was pretty excited about it because he doesn't get very many chances to swim, so he wanted to make sure that I got several pictures of him in the water. The thing that I did enjoy immensely about the lake was just the beautiful scenery, and then being in the middle of nowhere, there's almost no light pollution. It's one of the dark areas on the map of light pollution. So I went out and I got some photos before I went to bed of the stars and the night landscape. Went to bed. I got up a little bit after midnight. I went back out and set up my camera on the beach, and I didn't have a tripod, so I just strapped it to my backpack and set it up, pointed at the stars, and I was doing about 17-second exposures, and I was getting some really awesome pictures of the Milky Way. Over here in the US, just because of the light pollution, even in the middle of the country, it would take me about 10 minutes to get anything even remotely similar, and that's on a star tracker. Whereas over there, I was able to just set up right on the beach and take pictures. And then I also set up and sat out there for about an hour, hour and a half, and actually took a time lapse of the Milky Way rotating. And the way a lot of people that live around the lake make their income is they actually go out on fishing boats, and they fish most of the night. So there was a lot of lights right off on the horizon where I could see where all the fishing boats were. So Sunday morning, the next morning, we went to a local church that had a service in English, and then we also stayed for a little bit of the Chichewa service. The first part was pretty neat because they had music, and even though I didn't understand Chichewa, it was still neat to watch, but then it got pretty boring once they started the sermon because I didn't understand any of it. So then after that, we went to have lunch at the house of one of Prince's old friends. It was neat to get to see a little bit more of the food that they had over there, and at that point I was actually starting to be able to kind of tolerate some of the different foods. And then along the roadside, you'll see a lot of farmers, and people will just come and just sell their produce right off the side of the road. So we stopped to buy some tomatoes and potatoes. So Monday morning, I got to be a guest on Gret's podcast, which is called the Bad Missionary Podcast. Normally on the podcast, he and Prince will sit down and talk about local events in the U.S. and in Malawi. And this particular time, we talked about the shootings that had happened in Orlando. And the reason they had me on the podcast was kind of to share my experiences being my first time in Malawi. And it was really neat to get to be on the podcast because I've watched Gret's channel for a long time, and I've also listened to a couple of his episodes on the podcast. So if you want to go check that out, it's episode 36. So then later that evening, Prince and Juma took me out to a village called Malika and gave me a short tour of it. And while we were walking around, we found a lady who was very sick. They weren't sure what she was sick with, but they were assuming it was malaria. Gret actually arrived a little bit later and was able to give her a malaria test and determine that that's not what it was, but she was extremely dehydrated. So we never found out what the problem was, but it was kind of neat to get to see the malaria test administered. And the village of Malika also actually has a small school, and the group Live Love, who was over there on a missions trip from the church from Arizona, was actually going to be coming later that evening. So all the students were practicing songs and dances and rehearsing things, and they were playing a lot of games. And I got to watch that. It was pretty neat to see.
You're not alone, whether today or tomorrow, because God is with you all the time.
So the next day we went to another village called Chungaluma and got to mop houses for some of the widows, which really to me didn't seem like a big deal. But the widows in Malawi are considered, for the most part, the lowest of the low, because a lot of times when they lose their husband, the husband's family will come in and take everything, even including her house from her, which is one of the reasons that Gret does his organization Homes, is to build homes for these widows. And so we went around mopping some of these houses, and from my perspective, it was no big deal just mopping some houses, but for the widows, it was a huge blessing. It was really neat to get to see the expressions on their face, because somebody that they perceived to be up at the top of their class, social class, was humbling himself and coming down and mopping their house. And it's just breaking down those walls between the classes, and it was just super neat to get to see the expressions of gratitude on their faces. And being out in the village was a really neat experience. I actually got to draw water from a well for the first time with a bucket and a rope. The water was really murky, and that's the water that they use for drinking and cooking because they just don't have anything else. It was also really cool getting to communicate with some of the people over there. For the most part, they just spoke Chichewa, and Prince and Juma taught me some basic greetings in Chichewa, but I couldn't really actually communicate anything more. But there was still a lot there as far as nonverbal communications and, just handshakes, and it was just a great time hanging out with the people and getting to connect with them and kind of laugh at my bad pronunciations. Even though we didn't speak the same language, there was still a connection there. It was really neat. And the one thing that I really realized while I was over there is that even though these people have almost nothing, they are some of the most generous people and most joyful people that I've ever met. And that point was really driven home to me by an experience I had after mopping a house, where these people who have almost nothing had actually roasted corn for us and peanuts, which they call ground nuts, which they also grow out there. And they just roasted them and gave them to us, and it was really neat that even though they have nothing, they're willing to share what they do have. While we were out at the one village, Juma had been wandering around and actually found a young boy who was very sick. Nobody knew what he had because his parents were too poor to take him to the hospital or the clinic to figure out what he had. So we decided we were going to take them to the clinic and get him the help that he needed. And we took his mom and his dad in our vehicle and dropped them off at the clinic. We ended up giving them 15,000 kwacha, which is about $2.11 in American money. And that was enough to cover the doctor visit, getting any medication that they needed, and also getting a taxi back to their village. In America, that would easily cost well over $1,000. A lot of times going into these villages, I was the first white person, or Mzunga, as they call us in Chichuba, that some of these kids had seen, and it was kind of neat to see their reactions and to kind of get to meet them. And a point that was driven to me over and over is just the joy and love that these people have for one another, even though they have absolutely nothing. Whereas the people in the U.S. who have anything that they could ever want are, for the most part, not satisfied with what they do have. So after that, we went to see Girls Shine Academy, which is located in the village of Makanda. And it was pretty neat for me because Gret's channel is one of my favorite channels, and his camera had actually broken down that week, so he actually asked me to film some of the construction and the progress of the building while we were there. So if you want to see some of that footage, go check out Gret's channel. It's the episode that was posted on June 26, 2016, entitled Remember When This Was Just a Field. And as I said earlier, this year, Girls Shine Academy has about 100 students, and they're hoping that that'll be doubled next year. So the next day, which was Wednesday, we went to another village and mapped some more houses for some widows, and then we went back to Girls Shine Academy because the group Live Love was there, and I wanted to kind of get to meet some of the people and kind of see what they were all about. And it was really neat getting to work alongside of them. We actually got to help plaster the walls inside of Girls Shine Academy, and the construction workers there were doing a really good job of making sure everything was really square and smooth, even with the very basic tools that they had. So talking with the people from the church in Arizona who were there on the mission trip with Live Love, without exception, every one of them said the neatest thing about being over there was getting to meet the people and just experience the love and generosity. And Wednesday was my last day in Malawi, so I decided to take Prince and Juma out to an American restaurant because they actually had a KFC in Lilongwe, so we went there for supper. I actually also got to meet up with Pastor Mark Panning, who works at a Wells Lutheran school over there teaching and training pastors in Malawi. And it was neat getting to talk with him because he's actually from the area of Wisconsin that I grew up in. So Thursday was the flight of my trip home, and the trip home I felt went a lot faster than the trip there. It was still really long, but I had a couple of less layovers, or shorter layovers, and I arrived back in Wisconsin on Friday night. So my trip was in early June, which is about the middle of winter over in Malawi. So the temperatures were quite similar to what they were over here, which is about 60s and 70s during the day, so it was quite comfortable. So I found Gret's channel through a podcast I listened to, which is called The Inner Tube by Josh Taylor and Kevin McCurry. And Gret has actually written in questions to the podcast, and they've talked about his channel several times, so I decided I'd check it out. And through watching his videos, I really started to like the idea of what he was doing over there. So I contacted him, and after several months of going back and forth, I finally got everything together so that I could go over there and kind of see what it was all about, what was going on over there, and the work that he was doing. So the biggest thing that I really learned from the trip was how well off we are here in America, but how discontented most people are still in America. And I just really learned a lot about the generosity of the poorest of the poor in a third world country, and the lack of materialism over there, because everybody else for the most part is kind of just as bad off as their neighbor, and so nobody's really trying to compete and get ahead of one another, and they just live their lives. Whereas here in America, most of the marketing is based upon getting the latest greatest thing and having a better thing than your neighbor has. So before the trip, I felt bad for the people living in a third world country who had almost nothing. After the trip, I actually feel bad for the Americans now who have almost everything but yet aren't content with what they do have. And they don't have the peace and joy that the poorest of the poor in Malawi have. The only thing I would have changed about the trip is that I wish I would have been able to be over there for longer, and I would definitely plan my flight a lot longer in advance so that I could get a much shorter flight if possible, because sitting on an airplane for 18 plus hours was quite difficult for someone who likes to get up and walk around a lot. There was no room for that. But most of the way I had a window seat though, and it was a 3-seat section, and there was only one other guy there, so we had a space between us, so that was a little nicer, having a little bit more room. So go check out Gret's channel and see the work that he's doing. Also check out his podcast, and then check out the DonorC app. Download it for your Apple or Android and just see how it works. Thanks for watching.